Hello and welcome to today's episode of Empowered Change, looking at real life challenges around diversity and inclusion. And I am Vicky Docker, Empowered Change Director, and I'm very passionate about helping both individuals and businesses to become more aware of different aspects of diversity. And one of the best ways to share that is to walk in somebody else's shoes and hear their stories. And I have a lovely lady I'm going to introduce you to in a moment. So I'm not going to mention that just for the moment. At Empowered Change, I work with businesses to come in and understand what your challenges are around diversity, or even your leadership practices, whatever your people challenges are. And these podcasts really highlight the ability to be able to understand the diversity aspect and how I can add value. So welcome to today's episode. And today I'm really excited to introduce you to Meg Licari. And Meg is going to introduce herself rather than me stealing her thunder. Meg, I'm going to hand over to you. Thank you so much for coming today.
Thank you.
Tell us who you are, what you do, what you're here to talk about.
So I'm Meg Licari. I'm a recent graduate of tourism management from Bournemouth University. Over the last 4 years of my degree, I've really tried to get out into the industry as much as possible. Travel's always been my biggest passion, and I've lived abroad, worked abroad, studied abroad, really spent a lot of my degree out of the country and out of Bournemouth. But I really found a love for diversity, equity, and inclusion in travel through working in organizations that are more value focused. And when I returned to university for my final year, it was really important to me to kind of research that area further, particularly LGBTQ plus travel, which is probably my biggest passion and what I probably know the most about. So I'm really glad I found that. And as I build my career, have an idea of what I want and what I want to do.
Wonderful. Well, welcome. Very much looking forward to this conversation with you. So you have recently graduated. So congratulations to you for that. You have a number of exciting opportunities that we can't mention yet, but I'm sure if anybody chooses to follow you after today, then they will learn, because you have a very active social engagement, which you can mention at the end for anybody who wants to connect with you. So congratulations on your recent graduation.
Thank you.
I have had the privilege of reading your dissertation, and there's some fascinating and interesting points in there about the lack of information to advise lesbian, non-binary and people from the trans community around the nuances about travelling. So can you share some of your key highlights with our audience that you learned when you did your dissertation?
Yeah, of course. So some of the biggest findings and the ones that were kind of considered new information to the travel academia community, probably the biggest one is the distinction between gender and sexuality. Because often when organizations target the LGBTQ plus community, they're kind of viewing out the community as homogenous. And the reality is that all the different letters of the acronym, all the different identities have different needs, and particularly the distinction between gender and sexuality is huge. But that isn't just gender identity, it's also gender expression, because several of the people I interviewed, if they didn't identify as trans, they may have been cisgender, but if they had a gender expression that was not traditional, like a woman that would present a bit more masculine, they were facing some of the same challenges that the trans people I interviewed were. So going forward, I kind of wrote that we need to expand our research of trans people, gender non-conforming people, also looking at the gender expression element, which has been referenced before in previous trans research, the kind of difference between being able to pass or not pass, people assuming you're cisgender, but it's definitely something that needs to be looked at a lot further. And then another big one is that previously the research had kind of found that you need to have your safety needs met in order to then have positive experiences. But I interviewed several people that had traveled to places that LGBTQ plus people are not welcomed and even in some cases criminalized. and they still had really positive experiences. And usually the commonality between those positive experiences was community and acceptance, finding queer community in places that's not necessarily the norm, but it's still there. And I think it's really important to not just look at gay travel havens as these places that you can have a good experience, but also the kind of complexities of traveling to places that it's not legal or it's not welcome, and still finding those happy experiences.
Fantastic. Wow. A couple of things, Meg. One, for those who don't know what cisgender is, can you explain what cisgender is?
Cisgender is what some people would call normal, but it is just simply identifying as the gender or the sex that you were assigned at birth. So I'm cisgender. You also identify as cisgender, and that's as simple as I can make it, basically.
Yep. Fabulous. I've had conversations with people before, and it's like, oh, what does all this terminology mean? And I think it's really helpful explaining some of these things so that everybody can understand. So thank you for that. And then you talked about countries that are accepting and countries that are less accepting. I'm not going to ask you which countries are not accepting. I don't think that's a fair question. Maybe something, if people want to know, they can connect with you separately. But for those countries that, from your experience, from your interview, for your dissertation, which countries have you found to be perhaps the top 3 countries of destination?
Well, it's very difficult because even the destinations that are very accepting, so the kind of traditional ones you would recognize is Puerto Vallarta in Mexico, San Francisco, Sydney, London. But one of the people I interviewed went on their honeymoon to Mykonos, which is seen as quite a gay haven, stayed at top-rated gay hotel. And when they checked in as a lesbian couple, they were asked if they were sisters and if they wanted a twin room. So even when you go to the places that you think will cater to you, unfortunately, it's not always the case. And people still have bad experiences in cities that, there'll be pride flags all over the place. That doesn't necessarily mean you're going to have a positive experience. One that was probably lesser known that several participants in my research mentioned is that they had really good experiences in Cambodia and Thailand. And those are probably the ones that are not presumed to be as welcoming or accepting. But a lot of people had really good things to say about those destinations.
That's really useful. Thanks, Meg. So it would be interesting to hear about some of your personal experience you've had when you're traveling or with others that you've traveled with. But tell us a bit about your experience.
Well, the biggest reason that I wanted to study this area, my research particularly focused on lesbians, trans and non-binary people, or gender non-conforming people. And the biggest distinction was for me traveling alone as someone that's very, straight presenting, straight passing, cisgender white woman. It is a very different research process than traveling with a trans person. And my partner's non-binary, so the difference in research we do when we travel together versus when I travel alone, it's huge. And you would think that it's safer to travel with your partner than alone as a woman, but actually in some cases that isn't the reality. It is so much more research, and then also being aware of if you're holding hands, if you're doing any kind of affection, if that is accepted, if that is something that's going to put you in danger. You have to be very wary of that. But also we've had such positive experiences. We had a trip together. We went to Belize, Guatemala and Mexico, and it was extremely difficult to find information about Belize in particular and Guatemala. But the communities online are probably the best resource available. There's Facebook groups, blogs, forums, people who have online communities. And just by posting in a Facebook group that we were going to do this trip, that is where I got all the information that we had. And it was mixed messages. It was some people saying, you shouldn't do this. And it was some people saying, don't worry about it, you'll be fine. Luckily, that was our experience, that we were in fact fine. But we definitely had some interesting conversations along the way of people being like, oh, you're good friends. And we would say, yes. And they'd say, really good friends. And you're not really sure if they know you're together. And you just have to kind of play it safe, but also it is important to almost show representation in communities where it's not as open to be trans or be in a same-sex couple. I had a really amazing conversation in Nicaragua when I was traveling alone with a girl that identified as bisexual. And she told me that her experience of telling her friends was really negative, and she couldn't believe that I live a life where my parents know my sexuality. I talk about it online, I talk about it in my job. That was really, really amazing for her to hear that people get to live a life freely like that. So I think it is important to go to places that aren't kind of already really accepting and have that experience with people.
How refreshing, and how lovely to be a role model, you know, and people, and you mentioned there, let's just take a moment, because you do on your Instagram and social media, you do talk in a really lovely, relaxed way. I've watched you, sometimes you're even putting your makeup on and you're talking about really, you know, emotive subjects, you know, around the whole LGBTQIA plus community. So how can people find you if they want to come and like look at what you talk about and learn from you?
I post the majority of my content on TikTok, which is Meg Sees the World, and then also on Instagram, it's the same handle. But yeah, TikTok is where I post the majority of my stuff.
So Meg Sees the World.
Yes, and someday there'll be a travel blog as well. That's in the works, but when I have some time to do that, I really want to have a blog as well.
Yeah.
But I'm sure you know, time is never.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I suppose the key question finally, you know, is the reason why I offer these podcasts is to help people to have an understanding, and particularly for HR community and those that lead people that are looking for tips about how to be more inclusive, how to support, particularly from a lesbian, non-binary and trans community perspective. Any hints or tips that you can share to them?
Yeah, I think number one is do the research, provide the education, or first of all, to understand the differences between those identities and not just looking at the community as one type of person that has one need or one thing that they that you need to provide for them. But one of the biggest things that was reflected in the research is a lack of trust, that there are a lot of companies now that are making a big effort to market to the community and try and show that they're accepting. But there was such a skepticism from the people I interviewed when I would ask them, you know, you see these hotel chains or airlines advertising to the community, how do you feel? And almost all of them said, I don't trust it, or pink washing, things like this. So I think that instead of just advertising in the way that has been kind of done traditionally, companies do need to do a bit more of the research about how to advertise in a more effective way and build that trust, which can look like providing greater representation than just having a kind of white gay male couple in an advert, having broader diversity, because also typically LGBTQ plus individuals are more concerned about oppression in general. So not just our own identities, but we have a greater interest in diversity, equity, and inclusion across identities. So that's something really important to think about as well. And also hearing directly from members of the community, hiring queer people to provide feedback on your policies, partnering with organizations such as like the International Gay and Lesbian Travel Association is a big trade association for tourism at least, and the United Nations World Tourism Organization with them have posted several reports, and these reports are really great. They have case studies of different organizations that have done it well. So often there are these kind of resources you can use. They're just not made super public, unfortunately. It's not always easy to find without doing a bit of digging. But I think it's really important to have LGBTQ plus people feeding back on these things, to hear from them directly and see what they need and what they want.
I think any industry then, not just travel. I think the 2 points that you mentioned there, the whole attraction piece and being seen from a branding perspective of being inclusive and having inclusive images and content on the website really helps. And then the other point about actually listening to your employees and hearing them talk. Having focus groups about what do you need, what's important to you, what are we not doing at the moment, what could we do more of, what's it like working here. Those sorts of things are really helpful for organizations to add into their strategy. Thank you, Meg. Any final comments from you today that you'd like to share with our listeners or people watching these sessions?
Yeah, I think the number one thing for any organization that I can say is just keep your messaging consistent throughout your business, because if you're going to market to the community and claim to be safe for them, you also need to make sure that your LGBTQ plus employees would say the same, that they feel that they are being respected and understood. And if you're going to market to the community and say that you're a safe space, that you need to make sure that if an LGBTQ plus person comes to your establishment, they have a good experience. And that means that it can't just be the marketing department that receive the education. That needs to be through all levels of the business, that everyone is on the same page and everyone has the same information. Because the number one thing, most of the kind of discrimination is not coming from hatred, it's just coming from ignorance. So by providing the education in the first place, you avoid a lot of very innocent mistakes. And that is the biggest piece of advice I can give.
So I think that's a really interesting point about branding. So your company might go out and look as though they are inclusive, but actually that comes back to the point about the focus sessions. But what's it really like working here, and actually hearing, does it align, and hearing from people, and maybe even some sort of recordings from businesses around some of that for people to talk about their experience might be quite helpful for companies as well.
Definitely.
Thank you. Well, Meg, thank you very much for your time. I know you've got some very exciting things coming up that you can't talk about, but I'm sure that people will see those things come out in the next sort of month or so. So very best of luck to you. I know you'll be fabulous wherever you end up, whatever you end up doing. And thank you for taking the time today to share some of your thoughts.
Thank you.
Thanks, Meg.